you're still here. Well, in that case, let's have episode 3 of A Look Inside Our Faith with me, Father Tom Quinn.
Salve Regina, Mater Misericordis.
Once again, welcome back to A Look Inside Our Faith. Today, as I mentioned last episode, we're going to continue our look at the sacred vestments that the priest wears at Holy Mass. Last week we looked at the various liturgical colors, and today we're going to focus really on the history and the spiritual significance of the various vestments that the priest wears at Mass. So, first we have, does anyone remember what this is called? I think I heard some of you say it correctly. This is the amice. And the priest, if you remember from last week, as he puts it on, he touches the top of his head first, and then wraps it around his neck to hide his collar, to hide his upper portion of his everyday garments. Now, the amice has spiritual significance as well as a practical purpose as well. And its spiritual significance is that of the helmet of faith. If we read St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 17, St. Paul exhorts us to put on the helmet of salvation. And what does a helmet do? A helmet protects. So as the priest is preparing himself for Mass, as he is about to go offer up the sacrifice of the Mass, he asks God to protect him from all distractions, the various things that can run through our heads. Right? The priest isn't immune from that. Right? Sometimes you hear people say, maybe even you yourself say, "Oh, I get so distracted during Mass." Well, that's really no different for the priest. Right? So he asks God to keep him focused, right? Focused on what he's doing. And as he puts on the amice, there's a prayer as he puts on the amice. He prays, "Place, O Lord, on my head the helmet of salvation, that I may overcome the assaults of the devil." Following the amice, the priest puts on this long white garment called the alb. Now, the alb comes from the Latin word meaning white. So, it's true to its form. That's why you see albs. Albs are white. Now, certainly the practical purpose of the alb is to completely cover the everyday dress of the priest. But it also, like the amice, has a spiritual significance as well. In St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, in the 3rd chapter, verse 27, he tells us that by our baptisms we have put on Christ. And so, when we put on the alb, it recalls the baptism of the priest in a particular way. It also recalls baptism in general, that all baptized Christians, through that sacrament, have been made one with Christ. They have put on Christ. They have clothed themselves with Christ. But it also points us forward. Right? So the alb might point us back to baptism, but it also points us forward as well. If we read in the book of Revelation, in the 19th chapter, verse 8, we'll read that St. John tells us that in his mystical vision he sees a countless number of people, a whole throng of people who are gathered around the Lamb being Jesus himself. And they are clothed in pure linen garments. And so the alb recalls not only baptism, but it points us forward to the marriage feast of the Lamb that we read about in the book of Revelation, pointing us all to our destiny, what God has called us to, that eternal life with him, right, made possible through the Lamb who is sacrificed, namely Christ himself. And the prayer the priest prays as he puts on the alb goes like this: "Purify me, O Lord, from all stain, and cleanse my heart, that, washed in the blood of the Lamb, I may enjoy eternal delights." The next piece of vesture that the priest puts on is called the cincture. And it's this woven, braided rope type garment. And he ties that around his waist, praying this prayer: "Gird me, O Lord, with the cincture of purity, and quench in my heart the fire of concupiscence, that the virtue of continence and chastity may remain in me." So, the practical purpose of the cincture is to keep the alb in place, right, to keep everything orderly, but its spiritual significance is one of the priest petitioning God to gird him. Right? Just as the amice, St. Paul tells us, it references St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians being the helmet of salvation, so too the cincture is like a belt, right? That belt for Christian warfare. And the priest asks God to increase in him that virtue of chastity, that virtue of having a pure mind, a pure heart, and a pure body as well. Now, after that, my stole has fallen to the ground, but the next garment is that of the stole. So when the priest puts his on, he kisses it. You'll see there's a little cross there. He kisses that as a sign of love. Why? Because the stole is the external sign of his priestly office. Maybe if you recall from last week's episode, you'll remember that I told you at one time the priest would historically cross his stole like this. That would be his particular way of wearing the stole, signifying his priestly office. And that only a bishop would have his stole hanging down flat, like this. However, in more recent times, the current liturgical guidelines of the Church has both priest and bishop wearing the stole hanging straight down. But nevertheless, the stole is a sign of the priestly office. And the prayer that the priest prays when he puts it on goes like this: "Restore to me, O Lord, the state of immortality which was lost to me by my first parents. And although unworthy to approach your sacred mysteries, grant me nevertheless eternal joy." Oftentimes, the priest will then take the two remaining flaps of the cincture and tie it around the stole to keep it in place, so everything is neat and orderly. Finally, the last piece of vesture that the priest puts on, do you remember the name of it? I'm sure some of you do. It's called the chasuble. The priest places it over his head, praying this prayer as he does so: "O Lord, you said, my yoke is sweet and my burden light. Grant that I may carry it so as to obtain your grace. Amen." Now, the chasuble recalls, in a spiritual sense, St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, when he tells the Christians of that community to put on charity, which is the bond of perfection. But it also recalls his second letter to Timothy, when he exhorts Timothy to endure his share of the sufferings for Christ. And so the chasuble represents both charity, love, and also represents that in the priest's life, his sharing in the one priesthood of Jesus Christ is also one that is going to bring him to the cross. It's not always going to be easy, but in those sufferings he does so in conformity to and in union with Christ. So, we'll see that the vestments that the priest wears has spiritual significance. On the practical and historical end of things, they developed from the dress of prominent men in the Greek and Roman times. And so those who were maybe involved in government or those who owned land would have worn this very similar kind of dress. And it was adopted into the church as Christianity took root. They adopted that dress, albeit they began to ornament it, they began to make it special. And as time went on, as the Roman Empire fell, as you had Germanic tribes in the north invading the Italian peninsula as times changed and as clothing changed. Nevertheless, the vestments that the church had begun to use based on that Roman dress didn't change, so it stayed in place. Right? Began to continue to be ornamented, and around the 8th century or so, we begin to have it codified more solidly, and that the various offices of sacred orders, the diaconate, the priesthood, and the episcopacy, namely that being a bishop, began to take its present shape. And so for many centuries now, the vestments of the church have been along these lines. Certainly there's very much more we could say, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the priest wears, its history, its spiritual significance, and its purpose in the sacred liturgy of the church. So that's it for this episode of A Look Inside Our Faith. Next time, we'll look at the significance of the altar, its spiritual significance, and its place within Holy Mass. God bless you.
Salve